This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. We are told a lot of stories as children. Sometimes those stories are worth revisiting as adults, both to find out what was true and to find out how they speak to larger truths. Mary Pilon dug into the story of the board game Monopoly, and what she found is that there's very much more going on under the surface. We discuss her book, The Monopolists: Obsession, Fury, and the Scandal Behind the World's Favorite Board Game. And then, Vanderbilt University professor Amy Jill Levine has spent a career explaining Judaism to Christians and Christianity to Jews. In digging deeply into the parables of Jesus, she finds lessons that provide a different picture than the one often portrayed. Her book is Short Stories by Jesus, the Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi. But first, here's my interview with Mary Pilon. And talk about that original idea for the game at the turn of the century, where you had this woman who was part of this special kind of utopian...
Right. So the game was created as a teaching tool against the monopolists of her time. So Lizzie McGee, the woman who created the game, she was a follower of Henry George. And today, most of us don't know who Henry George is, but he was a big deal in his time. He was a political economist. He wrote this book called Progress and Poverty that was a huge bestseller. And he, like a lot of other people at the time, around the turn of the century, he was really worried about income inequality and how the middle class was going to fare. So she makes the landlord's game as a way to teach people about how single tax theory and Henry George's philosophies could work. So the fact that today it's almost the exact opposite is like one of many of the great ironies, because she was very much concerned with people learning and thinking that monopolies were a good thing.
We get really tied up sometimes in all these things that, in a sense, maybe they don't matter, maybe they do. But in playing games, the rules, the way we do things, somehow or another, we all get really worked up about that. What kinds of rules can we all set up together on this playing board?
Well, one of the things I thought was so strange about the true story of the game is, as a fan of it, and I'd played it as a kid like everybody else, is that the true story mimics the game in all these funny and weird ways. There's winners, there's losers, there's competition. For years, I, like everybody, thought that a man had invented it during the Great Depression. Turns out that's not the case. It started with a woman in 1904. And one of the things that's been really gratifying about having the book out is, as a journalist, you're trying to get the facts straight, and researching the history of these people was challenging enough. And I really tried to avoid, making really sharp, opinionated twists and turns on things, but having people's feedback on who the winners and losers are in the true story was has been so far really fun.
And you have this kind of constant values discussion throughout, and then what remains is this symbolic way they've come to deal with this debate, which is this game and these rules, and then how you set up the game, and how you set up the rules, and who owns the rules, and so it just becomes a larger part of that broader debate about where is power and is it too concentrated, and where is wealth and is it too concentrated.
Now we don't really think of games as teaching tools. You think of Candy Crush and sitting on the subway and killing time. You think about video games and a lot of the controversy that's been aroused because of the violence in some of those games. But if you go to the origins of board games, in the United States at least, in the 1800s, and then look at kind of their evolution, they can be extremely powerful teaching tools. And it was really fun to look at other business and political games kind of throughout history and say that, wow, these really were a way of communicating ideas, and they are really powerful ways for people to show their ideas and how they actually work. And I think Ralph and Lizzie, it's interesting to me that that's the medium they chose. And these were people who were also writing on these topics. They were also talking about them, but there was something about using this as their vehicle that was really powerful.
And now, Amy Jill Levine on the Short Stories by Jesus. So you've kind of made a career of explaining Jews to Christians and Jesus to Jews. Before we get too deep into the specific book, how did that develop?
Basically, I'm a translator. I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Roman Catholic, so in order to survive, I needed to be able to be fluent in Catholic. I now teach in a non-denominational divinity school, which means in a regular classroom, I may have 40 to 50 different types of Christians out there. And I need to be able to talk with my students based on their background and their confessional identity. So I understand Christianity, but I'm Jewish. So I recognize we Jews don't know all that much about Christians, and most of the time we're afraid to ask, or we think it's irrelevant. And Christians know even less about Jews. So for a number of my students, we're a combination of the book of Leviticus, which they've never read, the scribes and the Pharisees who opposed Jesus in the New Testament, the Shoah, the land of Israel, and maybe a production of Fiddler on the Roof. So in order to understand each other, one of the things we need to do is understand the subtleties.
Within your book, one of the fascinating things to me is what it reveals about Christian commentary and culture, where here you've got people saying things about what Jewish culture is very frequently, and it's very offensive.
What happens with the overlay on the New Testament, and this material has been talked about in the Christian churches for 2,000 years, is the Jews look worse and worse and worse, and the stereotypes pile up one upon another. So I do think it's helpful for Jews to be familiar with the New Testament, in part so that when we hear some of those negative stereotypes, and we will, we would be in a better position to correct them.
One of the curiosities of the result of the approach that you take, where you say, let's contextualize these stories and put them into ancient Israeli culture, ancient Hebrew culture, is that adding that context, adding that specifically Jewish context, in a lot of ways removes it from a specifically Jewish story. So you take, for example, the story of the prodigal son. It's really just a story about a father and his sons, because so much of that commentary that is focused on what Jewish doctrine has to say, you find is incorrect.
In the parable, which is typically called the parable of the prodigal son, the prodigal, the wastrel, the spendthrift, takes part of his inheritance and he basically blows it in irresponsible, dissolute living. And then he gets hungry, he has no money, he's got no network. He finds himself working for a pig farmer, which is not a great job for a Jewish kid. And he realizes dad still has money, he's going to go home, right? And on the way home, his dad sees him in a distance and runs out and throws his arms around him and throws a party. And what I can do is say, wait a minute, first of all, it's not an allegory. It's a story of a guy with two sons. Any Jew, therefore, knows the plot line because we've seen that already. Adam had two sons, Abraham had two sons, Isaac had two sons, Joseph had two sons.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLING Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.